Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first online event, our first online edition of Safe Space for White Questions. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. This is a brand new kind of thing for us. We have run one of these events earlier this year in February, and our intention was to continue doing this on an in-person, casual basis. Something happened in March that kind of interrupted our ability to meet and hang out in person. So it took us a while, and we decided, why don't we just take this into an online space, because a whole lot of things happened in racial politics since February of this year. So, I just wanted to start by explaining a little bit about what this project is and kind of what we're doing here. And I'd start, of course, by recognizing the fact that most of us who are involved in this production are situated in unceded Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and territorial home and place that the Mi'kmaq still hold sovereignty over. The Canadian state, the Nova Scotian province, are in a very awkward, I think, sovereign contestation. And I think it's important for us to understand that it is a conflict that's ongoing. It's not just about the lobster fisheries. It's something that goes all the way back to and even before the treaties. So if that sounds confusing to you or any aspect of that, then really you're in the right place, because this is the sort of space where we can engage with questions as abstract and historical as that, or as run-of-the-mill every day as, I feel uncomfortable with people who live in my apartment building for one reason or another. This is a space that we've decided to very purposefully cultivate, where principally white people, but anybody else, can pop in and ask questions that they feel that they couldn't comfortably say in person, that they might feel that they're being shouted down for in person. And the political objective here, because, cards on the table, we always have political objectives. Our political objective is really simple. We believe that in this political environment, we want to do what we can to help build racial confidence and racial resilience amongst all people. And that this is a concrete way for us to bring about decolonization in a meaningful way, by helping people who might have been organized into thinking certain, we think untrue things about the history of race, the history of Canada, what have you, giving them an opportunity to deepen their learning on their own terms. So this is what we're up to today. I'm going to introduce myself and then the team, and then we're going to start with taking questions straight through to the hour until the hour is up. So sorry, I should have started by saying who I am. My name is Ajay Parasram. I'm an assistant professor in the departments of International Development Studies and History at Dalhousie University. I'm a multi-generational transnational byproduct of British Empire, by which I mean my ancestors originated in northern India, and as a result of economic processes, they couldn't feed themselves anymore in India. So they jumped on boats and ended up in the Southern Caribbean, where they became unintentional scab labor as the African population had just won their freedom and were negotiating for better working conditions. So it was into that context that the racial tension between the African and the Indian population in the Southern Caribbean began. And then out of that, my family ultimately moved to Algonquin territories. I lived in Mi'kmaq territories here in Halifax, where I grew up and went to school, and ultimately lived for a long time in Coast Salish territories on the west coast of Turtle Island, and went to grad school in Algonquin territories, again in modern day Ottawa. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Alex, who's been my co-conspirator since the very beginning of this project, to say a few words about himself and the project, and then we're going to pass it on to Courtney Law and Liam Caswell, who are very gracious student assistants helping us out with the projects, and they'll tell you a little bit about themselves too. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, AJ, for that introduction. Well, I think you've done a great job explaining the project and its roots, so I won't say too much about that, but I will just say welcome to everybody who's interested in joining us today. And a brief introduction to me. My name is Alex Kasnabish. I work as an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Mount St. Vincent University here on the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq people. I come from the Haudenosaunee territories in present-day Ontario. I was born and raised in Toronto, and I've been in present-day so-called Nova Scotia now for about 14 years. And I really come to this work as somebody who sees the university and my work as a researcher and teacher as an extension of my social activism. And so I am an anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian writer, teacher, and researcher. I come to this forum out of my sincere conviction that organized white supremacy is one of the most dangerous forces on the planet today and ruins the lives of white people just as much as it ruins the lives of non-white peoples too. So that's why we decided to open this space up. Just a little bit of background about me. My parents are both immigrants to this country, both of them propelled here from very different parts of the world by the forces of war and economic insecurity, but both of whom were able to come here and make a decent life for themselves out of their very hard work, and in a context that obviously was extremely racially violent in many ways. My father came from Burma. My mother came from Latvia. They both came here out of the crucible of World War II and all that followed it. And so I have been born and raised as a settler Canadian, a racially ambiguous settler Canadian on unceded, unsurrendered Indigenous territory. And yeah, I see my work and its extension into fora like these as a part of our collective work, our collective struggle towards liberation. So thanks for being here with us. Thanks to everybody who's helped us set us up. And now I'm going to pass it over to Courtney to introduce herself and her important role in this project.
All right. Hi, guys. My name is Courtney Law, and I'm a graduate student at Dalhousie's Department of International Development Studies. And I'm just so excited to be part of this project. I am a white settler Canadian, and so I'm learning along with everyone else day by day. And I'm really interested to see what people are asking and to hear all the answers from the two professors. Thank you so much, guys. Actually, I'm going to be passing this on to Liam Caswell.
Hi, everybody. My name is Liam Caswell. I am a PhD student in the history department at Dalhousie University. Dr. Parasaram is overseeing my minor field in international development studies. I am a several generations settler descended Canadian, born and raised in Mi'kmaq territory on the Dartmouth side of the harbor. And just as Courtney said, I'm looking forward to seeing some of the questions people bring up and the discussions that are brought up during this really interesting event. So thank you so much. I'll hand you back over to Dr. Parasaram.
All right, so I see we have the first question. So I'll just read this out loud. I'm not actually sure if all of you in the audience there can see the questions. You probably can, but anyway, the first question that we have is: the indigenous lobster fisheries threatens the sustainability of the lobster stock. Why should they be allowed to do this? Okay, I think that's a really it's a really intense and good way for us to start, actually, especially as this is a conflict that's unfolding as we speak right here. So, of course, the first thing I would say for my part here is that I'm not Mi'kmaq and I don't speak for the Mi'kmaq. So ultimately, what you're going to get from me is my perspective as a person who researches these things, but not a Mi'kmaq perspective. So in my opinion, looking at this, the question of sustainability is oftentimes used as a kind of blunt object to force people to forget about questions of sovereignty that actually underscore these issues. For starters, just empirically, and I would note that my colleagues at the Department of Biology did a study and released the findings of that study very publicly recently, saying that the claim about the unsustainability of the lobster fisheries as a result of the Mi'kmaq fisheries is completely unsubstantiated in science. Simply in terms of volume, it's just not anywhere near big enough to make that kind of an impact. So there's that at this level of science, but more at the level of politics and history. The question is whether or not Indigenous people have the right to set their own rules on their own territory. And we're in an unusually easy, if I can put it that way, situation with this particular issue, in part because even the colonial court system has agreed with the Mi'kmaq. And this is going back over 20 years now of law at the Supreme Court level. But even, and this is the only point I would want to make on this, even if the Supreme Court hadn't made that ruling, if we are in fact on unceded territory, it means that we need to be thinking in terms of the legal precedent that Mi'kmaq law and tradition establishes. And this is something that as settlers, we have never done in any organized way in this country. So I'm going to pass it over to Alex to see if he has anything that he would like to add to that.
Thanks, AJ. I mean, that's a great explanation. I do have a couple of things I would add to that, I guess. And I would say for those of you who are settlers like me and who are worried about the sustainability of fish stocks, and I guess, first of all, I'd ask you to put all of that resource-minded talk in perspective, right? Think about how you've just turned a whole living species into a stock that you are interested in maintaining. Ask for what purpose and whose stock and why. Well, you can look at the maps of fishing licenses off the coast of Nova Scotia, and you can see that Clearwater, a fantastically lucrative corporation, actually owns the rights to the vast majority of those stocks. And so it's not really settler fishers and Mi'kmaq fishers who are being brought into conflict over scarce stock. It is a stock that's been depleted by transnational capital, like Clearwater, that's busy harvesting the ocean floor and all the stuff that lives there for its own profit taking. So if you are indeed concerned, and I would encourage you to be concerned, I'm concerned about the sustainability of other life on this planet and the stuff that you might be eating or using to make money in your work, then absolutely, let's have a conversation about what makes our economy so unlivable for people. That is a common cause between people who are being actively oppressed right now, like the Mi'kmaq, and white folks too, who are actually not being oppressed as a result of their racial identity, but certainly are being exploited as workers under this shared system. So, I mean, this is one of the things that we want to highlight, I think, in these Q&As and in this discussion, is that if you feel as a person who's racialized identity is white, that your life is hard, we're certainly not trying to tell you that it's not, but we are trying to highlight how your life and its hardships are not made so as a result of your racial identity in this case, because we live in a system of structured white supremacy. So for the Mi'kmaq to exercise what AJ has already quite eloquently described as their not only their historical rights, but their rights guaranteed even under the settler colonial constitution of Canada, that's not the problem. The problem is that we're all being ground up in this larger system. And I mean, I'm sure I don't have to tell most of you about that, right? We've just come through, we'll continue to go through this pandemic that is putting many of us on the cutting edges of this system. Again, why are we insecure? Why are we precarious? Let's ask those questions. But it surely isn't groups who are actually further down the ladder than us who are causing the problems. It's those groups that are higher up that ladder, and those groups are not a purely racialized group. That's actually the ruling class. Let's talk about that. So I'll pass it back over to AJ now.
All right. Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for your question. I see we have another question up. I'm just going to take them as they turn up. So the next one in the queue here is, Premier Stephen McNeil has apologized for systemic racism and initiated a task force over the next 18 months. Shouldn't we wait to see what the task force finds? Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. So I had a look. I didn't get to hear the Premier's speech, but I did read a couple of articles about it after the fact. And I have to say, the words sound wonderful. You know, the words really do sound really promising. But the issue is, I mean, for me anyway, and this isn't a partisan issue, I could care less about what party was running where, but it's interesting to me that it took the sitting Premier until after he decided to resign ultimately and say that he's not going to be in politics anymore. Then he apologizes, and then he starts this task force. the issue that I would draw your attention to here is, okay, yeah, if he's willing to put up resources for this, there are people, people like all over our communities here in Halifax that have been organizing for decades, and certainly really intensely in the last 10 years. Precariously employed people, underemployed people who would benefit from having some of the resources reallocated to their projects in order to do this work. So my first question is, there's no need to wait. Like, we already know the content. If you take seriously the lived experience of people who have been living under, systemic oppression for a number of years, centuries even, then you should trust that they are the experts in what they need. And they, whether it's the African Nova Scotian community, whether it's the Mi'kmaq community, whether it's racialized people, new migrants, they have been very vocal through organizations, through publications, through endless amounts of, what's the word, like roundtable meetings where they've been called in, and various task forces, this and that and the other. So there's no shortage of knowledge and expertise out there. What I would say is that if the government of any stripe is actually going to take this seriously, then they need to put resources forward. And what putting resources forward might look like could be defunding, perhaps the police, which is something that people have been calling for. And we can talk about that in more detail if anybody wants to. But it literally has to mean taking resources away from things where they're currently being spent and reallocating in a serious way and a sustainable way to the project of dismantling systemic racism. And that's something we can all get behind, but we certainly don't need to wait 18 months for that. We've been waiting for hundreds of years for that. So I'm going to pass it to Alex to weigh in on that question as well.
Thanks, AJ. Again, I think a great and comprehensive answer, but I'll just add a couple of things that are really, let me be totally blunt here and just say, as somebody who works in an industry that is all about trying to secure new grants for projects, I would say this one is something we don't need another report on, and we don't need another task force. In fact, all the reports we already have. This research has already been done, and we don't need another group of people to, as AJ highlights, conscript those resources that really ought to be directed back into community. We've already had the Wortley report, for example, that has demonstrated comprehensively that there is systematic racism in policing in this city, and in fact across the country, and indeed across Turtle Island, and indeed around the world, because it's an entrenched function of that institution. And in our own society, we're already well aware, and there are books and books and books and articles and reports written about these same features, about the racism embedded in our public schools, about our institutions of government, our private industry, all these kinds of things. So I would say to some extent, I'd be even more cynical than AJ has laid out already, and say this is another smokescreen. This is, isn't it convenient, as AJ mentions, that a premier who's decided that he doesn't need to accrue any more political capital has made this nothing rhetorical suggestion that we can have another conversation and have another expert panel convened to write a description for a phenomenon that none of us is a stranger to. So let's get on with it. I mean, right now in my own institution, my university, we're having this conversation about the systematic oppression of Indigenous and Black scholars and staff and students specifically. And of course, what is the first move that the administration wants to make? The first move is to call for another study, another panel, another report, another working group. We don't need that. We know that there are too few students from those marginalized groups. We know we have far too few faculty from those groups. We know that we have far too staff from those groups. Why is that true? Because, again, of the research that's been done by lots and lots of folks working in our fields and others that has mapped systemic racism. But even more important, as AJ's pointing out, we know because we could actually open our ears and listen to the experiences of those communities themselves, who are telling us this and have been telling us this for time immemorial. And we could actually decide that we're going to make a move on this rather than actually waiting for another policy paper or another talking point. So I think, the time is now for action. It's much like the climate change question. There are always things that we can learn. I'm not trying to suggest that, right? Obviously, our knowledge of a phenomena is only deepened by our study of it. And I encourage people to do that and to do that work. But at the same time, you reach a certain point where it's no longer a question about the shape of the problem. The question is, when are you going to do something about it? When are we actually going to commit to action, right? When are we going to decide, for example, in the context of Nova Scotia and the fisheries, that 20 years ago, a decision was taken that clearly affirmed, even under Canadian law, that Indigenous people have the right to secure a livelihood on their own territories, right? That they've historically organized themselves on and carried out. 20 years later, we don't need to go back and reflect on that. What we need to do is actually make it happen, right? And in the same way, with systemic racism in society, we don't actually need to retrace that map. What we need to do is actually take action to abolish that map and draw a brand new one, a new set of social relations that, again, I think people probably don't have to imagine too hard how that might benefit us all to live in a less violent, less unequal, less oppressive society. Mm-hmm. So back to you, AJ.
Sure. All right. Okay, so thanks for that. I see that we are starting to get some more questions here. So it looks like the next two questions are somewhat similar. So I'm going to take them together. So I'll read them first. Does affirmative action lead to a situation where the best qualified people aren't the ones being hired? And then somewhat relatedly, why can't the focus just be on equal rights for everyone? Don't initiatives like reparations for slavery, affirmative action, or reconciliation just give certain groups special rights that white people don't have? So I want to take these two together because I think they're getting at the what I would call the kind of illusion of meritocracy. And let me explain a bit of what I mean about this. So I'll start by saying, so when I got my job here at Dalhousie University, it was through a diversity hiring line. What it meant was that Dalhousie decided that they were going to prioritize hiring a racialized person to teach on that, whatever that hiring line was. My hiring line was colonialism, post-colonialism, and development, with an emphasis on the British Empire. So, you could look at that and be like, okay, why is this reserved only to a racialized person? And the answer is, it was a way that the institution took to address the fact that they had a systemic problem in terms of representation. And that's how it worked in the university. And you could say, okay, well, that's just kind of like an ivory tower kind of thing because of people's scholarship. But that same kind of problem exists in institutions all over, whether it's, law practices, whether it's janitorial practices, whatever the workplace is. The problem of diversity and inclusion or affirmative action, however you want to call it. The problem is it is being described as someone who does not have the qualification getting the job, instead of turning the emphasis instead on the organization, on the employer, and say, how is it that in the year 2020 you have allowed it to be that you've hired mostly or only white people, generally speaking, mostly or only white men? Is it that you believe that only white men have the qualifications? And of course, people would argue, well, that, if somebody has a PhD or if somebody has whatever these qualifications are, then that means that's what it is. But hiring committees don't work that way. And for any of you who have actually been on a hiring committee, there's a lot of analysis of CVs where people's lives are basically just quickly discarded, and it can be for things that aren't going to be documented in the minutes. So, and the other thing I would add before I pass this over to Alex is that the issue tends to get picked up a lot by conservative and right-wing commentators who want to make this about like a leftist cabal or something. And it really has nothing to do with left or right. And that's also part of the problem here, because what I think is true about critiques of affirmative action is that it essentializes a person only for their kind of racial identity. And that's problematic because it's a very liberal project that says, oh, well, any Indian person can represent Indian people. Any like black person can represent all black people. And of course, as racialized people, the color of our skin is one very important aspect of our identity, but one among a huge variety of different aspects of our identity. I'm also a political scientist. I'm also a father. There are all these other intersections that are significant to that. So the one tool that I would offer you in terms of trying to make sense of why the idea of a liberal meritocracy is a bit of an illusion is simply the fact that it gives institutions a free-for-all to say we are already perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with us. We just need to sprinkle a bit of paprika in there. You know what I mean? And that's not what it's about. If you're interested in making structural changes, you have to hire people in sufficient quantities and give them sufficient resources so that they can make the structural changes that are necessary. Because otherwise what ends up happening, and I can tell you this from experience, and just ask the person of color that you work with, I'm sure they'll say the same thing, especially in this day and age, you end up being asked to be the figurehead of basically every diversity and inclusion workshop or project or anything that you can imagine, and you get so overworked without having enough of you there in critical quantities to share that work, that it stymies all of your other work. And that is related to the reason why, the white males in whatever industry who are perhaps less inhibited by a lot of these other intersections end up progressing along that stereotypical trajectory. So yeah, over to you, Alex.
Thanks, AJ. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, and I'm really paraphrasing right now from an excellent book I'm reading called Blood and Politics, which is all about organized white supremacy, the history of organized white supremacy in the modern United States. To quote the author poorly, whiteness is the original affirmative action. And I think that really needs to be understood. Like, whiteness, as much as any other racialized identity, is a fundamentally historical and constructed concept. It's not anything, as an anthropologist, I'm going to say this, but the American Association of Human Geneticists released a policy statement on it just a couple of years ago, because, of course, in our current moment, we have to have geneticists weighing on this, and they decried the use of the misinterpretation of genetic research to support any kind of racial supremacist project, saying it was complete baloney, it was complete phony science, that you can't do that. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as any truth to believing in the existence of distinct and separate human racial groups or human races. There's one human race, right? So the differences amongst us are important. There's nobody's trying to suggest they're not important. The differences in culture, in history, in class, we're differentiated according to our sexuality, our gender identity, our politics, our ability, all kinds of things, right? So of course you're different and you matter and you belong to a group. And if you choose to identify into that group, that's wonderful. And you should feel free to nurture that group identity. So long as it's not built upon the systematic oppression and destruction of other groups of people, okay? You don't get to do that, actually. And living in a world, well, let's just talk about the equality Trojan horse here. So I'll just say, as a scholar of fascism and the modern far right, it is one of the oldest and most familiar tropes that far right activists and white supremacists have used as a culture war issue to wedge the debate open and to basically practice racialized politics without using racist language, because open and avowed racism, as Trump so well demonstrates, really doesn't fly anymore. Even Trump has to use his dog whistles, right? He has to signal to his base. He can't come out openly and say he hates black people in a way that politicians of previous generations might have been able to do at certain points, right? So instead of talking about white supremacy and white power, what they talk about is, what we want is equal rights for everyone, and that means everybody should be considered on the basis of their merits. Okay, then let's do the math. Let's talk about the accrued wealth and privilege, social and cultural capital that white people bring into their competition for jobs and resources, right? Let's talk about the fact that the number one determining factor of whether you're going to go to university or not is whether your parents did, right? Which is a reflection of your social class, your wealth, and most of that, let's face it, right? If you're inheriting that money, if you're inheriting it over generations, you don't even have to be fantastically wealthy. Again, we know this from research that even average so-called middle class, the working class whites in the United States and Canada have amassed far greater inherited wealth than Black people or racialized people who are actually working in much more well-paid positions right now. That's like an index of how we carry that wealth forward in really unjust and unearned ways. So it's not slagging on white people, right? To suggest that you didn't earn your position, but it is to say that you started many steps ahead in those competitions often, right? You don't have to feel bad about who you are and what you're doing, but you have to recognize the fact that we are not all starting from the same starting line, right? So when we think about things like the admittedly limited attempts to address inequality in society, like affirmative action policies or targeted hiring policies, that is indeed, I would agree, insufficient to actually address the problems we face. But my objection to them isn't that they go too far. It's that they don't go far enough in many ways. And again, that's not to pit the fortunes of working people against one another. It's to say that historically we live in a society that has unjustly privileged and lifted, I actually don't like the language of privilege in this way, but has unjustly lifted up certain groups of people in order to pit those people against other groups of working people so that a ruling class can collectively exploit us all. So it's worth thinking about how this rhetoric of equal rights actually disenfranchises white people too, how it takes your eyes off the prize, off the ball in a critical moment, and encourages you, rather than organizing yourself to transform your world into a livable, just, secure, democratic, peaceful, satisfying place. It encourages you instead to do greater violence to people, again, who are actually further down that ladder than you. So, let's be clear about where these racial categories come from. Let's be clear about who they serve. Let's be clear that this animosity and this hatred of groups of people on the basis of imagined and highly generalized characteristics is a ploy on the part of powerful people to organize us against each other and to split our collective power. Yeah, I guess I would just leave it at that, and I'll pass it back to AJ.
All right, thanks so much for that. We're getting more questions coming in, which is wonderful. I think maybe we can take the next two together here as well, from Anonymous and then from Zach. So I'll read them out and then try and address them both together, because I think there is some overlap, not totally, but how can white people get more involved with racial justice movements without falling into the white savior complex? And some of the community groups that I'm a part of are mostly white. There's lots of interest in opening up space for BIPOC folks, but we're afraid of tokenizing people in the process. What strategies should we use to make folks feel welcome and not tokenized? These are really good questions, because what I like about these questions is that it first and foremost takes the burden of action onto the white person in this context, so that it has become less about what can racialized people teach me about something, and more about what can I do to actually dismantle some of this. So in terms of the first question, the answer is really straightforward. What can you do to get involved without the white savior complex? Turn up and don't try to be an expert. Don't go to an event because you think you know something already about whatever the issue might be, whether it's gentrification, whether it's treaty rights or something. Show up and be willing to show up consistently and do whatever is necessary. And that can take a lot of different forms, like if you're a person who has access to resources, that might take the form of contributing financially. One concrete example is when I first moved back to Mi'kma'ki after being away for 10 years, That was when the Cornwallis Must Fall campaign, activists were trying to take down the Cornwallis statue. I hadn't made enough inroads with the activist community, and I felt similarly. I didn't really know what to do, and I didn't want to try and present myself as somebody with like expertise who wasn't involved in the movement. So I turned up at a couple events, and then I turned up at a big one. And I made, my partner and I, we made about 300 or 400 pakoras, and we called it Solidarity Pakoras. And we set up shop, and we just, it was all pakoras by donation. And all of the money, we just took it and put it in a bag and then handed it over to the Mi'kmaq warriors who were there, who we understand were organizing. And one of the really great cultural experiences of that, from my perspective, was that I got to introduce a couple of Mi'kmaq elders to a vegetable pakora. They had never had vegetable pakoras before. So all of a sudden, just through turning up and doing something, I was able to, without knowing what to do and without knowing how I would be received, I was able to make a meaningful cultural connection. And I think that is, if you turn up and if your intentions are good, it might take a few times to get noticed and for people to trust you, but they will. They almost always do. And that's something that's not just a racialized component. Like, that's in all of my experience in activist spaces, that's what it takes, whether it's class politics, whether it's racial politics or decolonization. And I think we can apply some of that to this idea of the community groups, So one way that you can do, so one thing that one organization did when I first moved here as well, that will be useful for Zach's comments. This was, I don't think they would mind me saying it, but it was Solidarity Halifax. In the wake of the Quebec mosque shootings, they also were a predominantly white group at that time. And what they did was they reached out to a couple of racialized people, Muslims, myself. So maybe, I don't know if they confused me for a Muslim, which is an honest mistake, and it happens all the time. But they invited us all to dinner. They said, we want to make a meal for you. We want to take a little bit of the burden off of you for an evening, and we just want to talk. So they made us dinner, and there was a group of us. We turned up. We didn't even know what to make of it, and we had a nice meal and really good conversations. And out of that conversations, they found, Solidarity Halifax found ways to plug into the organizing that we were already doing, and we found ways to plug into the organizing that Solhal was doing too. And mistakes were made, and it felt really awkward along the way, but those are the things that you work through together. And I think that's really that is the process of building solidarity. So I'll pass it over to Alex now, who has a lot of experience in this field as well.
Thanks, AJ. Yeah, great examples, of course. And I would say, really just to build on the points that have been already made, I would say, if you find yourself in the midst of an overwhelmingly white identified group, or you work in an overwhelmingly white identified space, like I do in my university, which is overwhelmingly white in that way, and it's certainly in terms of its makeup, the employees, then rather than trying to do what AJ suggested earlier, which some administrators do, which is to shake a bit of paprika in there and stir it up and just try and add that ingredient in, organize where you're at. If you are a white person who doesn't know many racialized people, then talk to other white people about your concerns about racial justice. Open up those spaces. There's nothing wrong with actually, as a white identified person, working in a primarily white identified space to make it less racist, to help other white people wean themselves off of white supremacy and an aspiration to deepen white power. You may not find that racialized people want to do that work with you or for you. In fact, there are many people who are asked time and time again, with the best of intentions, to show up for white organized events and for a primarily white audience, and asked constantly to do the work of helping us change our ways. And I think it's not hard to see how that places the burden yet again on marginalized and oppressed groups, right? So it's not that you shouldn't be opening up space. It's great. You should be a welcoming, inclusive, diverse crew if you can be. But if you are not, and you find that most of your relations aren't, then don't try to force it. Organize where you are at in the spirit of racial solidarity and justice, and then find those connections in coalition building. Okay, seek out organizations of racialized people and see what you can do to work together, but not simply by adding their members to your group. I mean, this is a really key thing for me as an organizer and as an activist and as a scholar who studies this stuff. It's one of the best lessons we learn, right? And I mean, there's just so many ways that you can be useful without taking ownership, without trying to recruit members from existing organizations, and without taking leadership that you really don't need to have in these cases. There was another point that I was going to make around white organizing, white activism, and it totally escapes me now. So maybe it will pop back into my head. But just to add one more quick point, because we've seen so many questions about this affirmative action issue, I just want to bring it back to that very briefly and point out that it always gets my bell ringing a bit. And I'll be honest about this. I always find it interesting to see where talking points are come from, because equitable hiring initiatives in Canada are actually not called affirmative action initiatives. That is United States legal language. So I'm always curious to know what media people are reading and what politics they're following and where they're getting their talking points. And quite frankly, I've seen lots of young, angry, aggrieved white men in my classes who rage about affirmative action. And then I say, but bro, you don't have affirmative action here. And then they go on to cite some US statistic or some US talking head, and that says it all, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't be invested in those politics. Obviously, they matter to us. But it is a sign of where you're getting your ideological talking points from. So please, if you're a white person looking for meaning in the world, do not find the lowest form of troll-sponsored media that you can access as a way of exercising your grievance that way, right? Again, there's lots of reasons to be engaged and mad, but by actually fueling yourself with that misinformation, you're contributing to the problem and not helping solve it, and you're not helping yourself either. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that. And sorry, other point about organizing in primarily white spaces has eluded me, but AJ's given so many good specific examples that I think I'll just leave it at that. Back to you, AJ.
Thanks for that, Alex. So the next question on our list here is, I understand it's important to recognize history, but why and how can we make reparations? Okay, I think the question is, how can we make reparations to the current generation? That's a really good question, and I'll start by just plugging this really insightful video. I don't agree with everything he says, but there's an Indian writer named Shashi Tharoor who took up this debate at the University of Oxford a number of years ago. And his speech went viral about reparations for colonialism. And he ended up writing a book about it, actually, after the fact. So after today's talk, just Google Shashi Tharoor Oxford debate reparations. And you can hear a super eloquent justification in principle for reparations for colonization. But I think the spirit of this question is, what does this practically mean to the current generation? Because Tharoor says reparations don't have to be financial. They can be like $1 or something like that. It's about atonement. I disagree with him about that. I think reparations should be financial, and I think they should be significant. So, we can make reparations meaningful. If we flip back to Stephen McNeil's claim that he was going to start this other committee that's going to consider this and that, put the money up front, So if we were to do a kind of economic analysis of the way in which Nova Scotia, for example, since we are mostly here, benefited from the triangular trade that connected, England to Africa, to the Caribbean, to, I guess it's a square trade when you think of it with that extra vertice. But that circular trade is what enriched Halifax and made Halifax in particular a hub of the British Empire. You can come up with dollars and cents and calculate that. Economists have done that. But that does sidestep the broader question of how do we actually reallocate resources here and now. And to me, I think the way we do that is by actually changing what the law says, changing the legal basis of our society. And that can take a couple different ways. One is to actually engage with and understand what law on Indigenous terms might look like. And there are wonderful Indigenous legal scholars. Pam Palmater comes to mind. She's a Mi'kmaq legal scholar. who has lots to say on this subject and has her own YouTube channel, so you should definitely check out that one. But it could also take the form of much more kind of concrete measures like defunding the police, which members of the African Nova Scotian community have been calling for. An end to street checks, a meaningful end to street checks, to actually taking the steps to remove that authority from the police, which, in principle we have, but in practice we don't because it's not enforced. So reparations can take or a start to reparations can take the form of actually altering the way society operates, that acknowledges the past grievances or the past crimes against racialized populations. But I also personally believe, along with other people here in the community, that there should be dollars and cents reallocated as well. And that would make a huge difference when you look at the distribution of wealth and its racial consequences in the Maritimes, for example. There should be a reallocation of public money that goes towards that. And the last thing, and our colleague Chike Jeffers in the philosophy department, he made this point when asked this question a couple years ago. If when you say Black people, for example, would be the beneficiaries of reparations at everyone else's expense, remember that would also be Black people paying themselves back. When we say we are referring to the Canadian public, and that includes all of us. So this is not like a reallocation of money from white people to Black people or to Indigenous people. These are people who are all part of Canadian society, recognizing that there's a structural problem in Canadian society that needs to be fixed. And you wouldn't expect a plumber to go in and fix your pipes without having any pipe. You need that as the fundamental basis from which to make structural change. So I'll pass that over to Alex if he has anything to add there.
Thanks, AJ. So yeah, I have a few things to say here, and I would just say, first and foremost, that when we're talking about these forms of injustice, we are not primarily dealing with moral structures or systems, right? We're dealing with material systems that used people up, put them on the cutting edges of those systems, stole their autonomy, robbed them of dignity, took their labor and put it to use for someone else. They had no decision-making capacity, ripped their children from them, put them in prisons, did damage to their bodies, and all these things are a material legacy of these structures of exploitation and oppression. So we cannot resolve them without actually accounting for that misdistribution, that theft, that enclosure of that stolen wealth. It is not possible. So I'm going to say that just to start with. So you want a just society, then you have to settle accounts, okay? Mm-hmm. You run away from your favorite bar when we were doing things like going out to bars. You run away one night without paying the tab. You go back the next night and say to the owner, "Hey man, sorry, I really love you. You just let me drink here again, right? I'm not going to pay that tab, of course, but I want to come back and just enjoy your hospitality again. That's cool, right?" Nobody would expect to do that, right? In the same way that you can't simply reconcile these systems of violence and dehumanization by saying sorry. Like our political class in this country, like McNeil just demonstrated, loves to say sorry when it makes them look like good moral people. But as soon as there's some materiality to that, that's when they're like, whoa, we don't want to get crazy now. So absolutely, changes to the legal structure, an accounting of what that means economically and financially. But again, nobody's coming for your toothbrush, okay? We don't want your personal stuff. People, settlers always, and racialized white people seem to think and have been told by very cunning propagandists and activists that they ought to be worried about somebody coming to take their own lives away from them. And listen to the questions that we got about affirmative action. The same idea. We live in a fundamentally precarious economy that's been designed that way by the wealthiest to keep the rest of us insecure and desperate and controllable, right? That's the reality. But then when we talk about settling accounts, racialized justice accounts within the system, then people who feel like they're a little bit ahead and have been buffered from the worst consequences of that system suddenly express fear of those others who have much less, because that's what we're socialized, what we're trained to do in this society as a result of these relations of ruling. So we can't fall for it. We got to be adults about this. We have to be grown-ups and say, I understand that there has been a systematic wrong done that, yeah, I wasn't around for and I didn't kickstart, but that I am a participant in, I belong to this world belongs to me, I cannot disown it, I must take responsibility for it and act justly within it, and that means accounting for this, right? Everybody knows that when a wrong is done to them personally, they want that rectified, right? You would demand that. And so in the same way, we must, in order to live in a society where we can all feel we enjoy justice, autonomy, dignity, democracy, peace, all these things, we have to build it forward that way. We cannot simply wish it to be so. So that demands material reparations. And yeah, if you're worried about where it's going to come from, well, I used the example of Clearwater before. Why don't we go ask John Risley where that could come from? John Risley is the beneficiary of millions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies every single year for Clearwater, right? In addition to the fact that the super rich in our society pay an abominably low level of tax, right? So we want to figure out how to do these things. You want to figure out how to fill the potholes on the street, how to build decent schools with good ventilation so our kids aren't all getting, COVID-19. You want to figure out how to fuel community development and not be dependent on a fickle tourist industry or overfishing the oceans. Well, yeah, let's do that. We actually create more than enough wealth to do that with. Let's take it back from the ruling class that has conscripted it from us, given it to corporations and others. Let's take it back from the police, who haven't made our communities any safer, actually, and only made them more violent and more crime-ridden. Let's take it back from the military, for example, and let's deploy it here. We have lots of resources. We live in an incredibly wealthy society, but most of us don't know that because we're not allowed to have meaningful decisions around how that wealth is used and where it's sent, right? And if we could see that, I mean, you can throw a stone and hit stories on the internet about this. Look up, just Google Panama Papers and see how much the super rich have hidden in offshore. We're talking about tens of trillions of dollars hidden in offshore tax accounts, tax-free savings accounts. Like, think about what you could do with even one of those trillions of dollars, right? We could solve all of our problems if we actually took back that wealth that's been unjustly taken from us. So I would say let's begin there. And again, in the spirit not of charity, but in a spirit of collective liberation. That my own liberation is tied up with the liberation of everyone else, that your freedom means greater freedom for me. And I think that's a wonderful thing that we could all look forward to, actually. Back to you, AJ.
All right. Thanks for that, Alex. So we've got about just 5 minutes left, and I see 2 questions in the queue. So let's take the 2 questions together, and then Alex will give us some parting words. I think definitely this shows that we probably do want to continue doing this. So there will be more events like this coming down the pipeline, not the oil pipeline. Anyway, so next on my list here is Lindy, and then I'll add that anonymous one as well. So what is the right terminology to call prejudice between oppressed or disenfranchised races, groups, versus between white people and those groups? They seem like different situations, and should minorities or oppressed and disenfranchised groups be given an extra pass if they themselves are prejudiced against other such groups, as they may not have capacity or energy to afford such fairness due to being oppressed themselves? Okay, so that's kind of, it's a complex question, and to paraphrase what I'm hearing and how I'll answer that is that, it seems as though racialized groups, I think the term you're looking for is lateral violence here, like in terms of how, like, for example, African and Indian communities in the Caribbean, where I'm from, fight each other rather than addressing structural white supremacy. That's lateral violence, and it exists across lots of different intersections of not even just race, but class, sexuality, etc. So that's the term you're looking for. And about giving them an extra pass, I don't think that anybody should have to sit with forms of racial or discrimination or oppression. What it might come down to is having a little patience in terms of how you work to collectively liberate one another. You know what I mean? So it's not about giving them an extra pass, but it is about recognizing, as Lindy does here in her question, that they're facing lots of different kinds of struggles to educate themselves. And in fact, so I wrote a paper last year called Pathological White Fragility and the Canadian Nation. And in that paper was kind of the seeds of why we were doing this group, because doing this session, because what it came down to was we want to be able to make space for people of color, racialized people, to make the same ignorant mistakes that white people get a free pass on. So it's not about giving an extra pass. It's about recognizing that white people have always had the extra pass, and we just want everybody to have that same pass. You know what I mean? So be passionate, be considerate to one another, and don't always try to like figure out, you know, what is saying this exactly right. Be willing to make mistakes in the spirit of collective liberation, like what Alex was talking about. And just quickly on this last point, before I pass it over to Alex to conclude, how can I speak to people who have police officers and their families about systemic racism in policing? This is such a big issue, I think, especially in the Maritimes. And I'll start by saying my brother is a police officer. So whoever posted this question, you know, I hear you. This affects all of us in our families. Some of my oldest and dearest friends are police officers that I've had really like unpleasant fights with over the last 10, 15 years. And the best thing that I can say to you is this: know that when you're talking to family and loved ones, that you need to have an extra level of care and compassion for those people. Try where you can to present facts, and those facts can be historical. You know, there's lots of good literature out there that speaks to the colonial history of the RCMP and you know how the RCMP were basically created as a paramilitary force to aggressively and violently colonize the West. These are not disputed facts. Even the most right-wing historian in Canada would have to concede that this is a thing that happened. You know what I mean? So try and keep it to the facts. Try and focus on what people who experience oppression are saying. And then also talk about, you know, in the same way that we might say white people have been organized into certain kinds of like institutional thinking about whiteness or about not thinking about race, so too have police officers been organized into understanding a world of violence that they are then kind of robocoping their way into. So, you know, especially when those people are in your family, exercise a good deal of care. And know that you're not going to change anybody's opinion in 1, 2, or even 10 conversations. So if you're serious about helping them think through it, know that you got to be in it for the long haul. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye and pass it over to Alex to answer these questions and then conclude our session for this month.
Thanks again, AJ, and thanks everybody for your amazing questions today. It's been really, really stimulating to be with you in this forum. And as AJ said, we're going to do this again, so stay tuned for our next event date. But just really quickly to conclude, you know, these questions are so interesting. Just AJ said so much on both of them, so I just want to highlight a couple of things. The first question, yeah, I mean, when living under conditions of structural white supremacy, the only racism that is possible is racism directed against non-white peoples, because racism is not about bad feelings in our head. It's not about having bad thoughts or negativity towards people. It's a structural relationship of power between identified groups of humans. So yeah, I'm one of those people who would argue, for example, it's not possible for Black people in our society to be racist against whites, because Black people as a group lack the institutional and structural power to make use of that kind of relationship. But of course, in different contexts, let's say in the context of you know, of Japan or Burma or India or Mexico, I mean, in any of these different contexts, racism can be organized internally very differently, right? With groups of people, it doesn't have to be white supremacist. It can elevate another group of people. So racism in that sense is kind of an empty container of really awful, toxic relations. But in our global context, racism is bound up with white supremacy because of the historical trajectory we found ourselves in, because of the constellation of facts that we've been kind of excavating today a little bit. So no, I don't think anybody gets a pass, for example. I think that this is nurturing these kinds of systematic ill feelings and awful relationships between groups is a way that people in power, again, keep us pitted against one another. So we can't do that. But the work of weaning ourselves off of these terrible toxic relationships is difficult and long-term work. And we have to exercise care in that. So just to conclude by talking about that second question, I would say absolutely. So many of us work inside of institutions that have really terrible outcomes, right? Even as a university professor, I don't work in some wonderful utopia. We are wrapped up with all kinds of awful systems, institutions, outcomes in our society. The university is a powerful institution bound to other ruling institutions in our society. So I don't get a pass. I'm not innocent from that. Now, I don't have the power to arrest people. I don't have the right to pull a gun when I feel like my life is in danger and riddle somebody with bullets like a police officer does. So perhaps the stakes are different for me, right? But it's no less problematic. What I would say is, as AJ's already said, be kind, right? But also be a little bit uncompromising with this. I'm always troubled when people say they feel they can't talk to family because they're worried about ruining encounters and dinner parties and good family relations. If we don't talk to the people who are closest to us, especially as white identified people, we will never make any change in this society. You are not going to convince people by ranting at them on social media or by performing your resistance to people you're never going to see again. You will make change by making it impossible for people to continue to exert racist actions and relations in your presence by making that untenable. Hopefully, you can show them other ways of being in this world. That's the point. And to be understanding about why and how they find themselves in the positions they do. Many people do work that they can get, right? And we live in a society that elevates police officers to the status of superheroes, as a result of all the propaganda we watch all the time on TV and our streaming media. So that's a super difficult myth to bust. But we have to do that work. We have to do that work gently. We have to acknowledge also people's real feelings. So people will say, oh, but I want to be secure. Be like, yeah, you have the right to be secure in the world. We have the right to deal with dangerous people, for sure. We can figure out how to do that. We can do that without actually leveraging a much greater form of violence against whole communities in doing so. Again, it all comes back to that principle of collective liberation. I'm in it for you, but I'm also in it for me. So I see that we were now definitely officially over time, and I just want to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank everybody who's helped make this possible, and all our hidden support people right now who are doing the important work of keeping this all working and going. And I want to say to all of you, if you're with us right now or watching this later on, that we hope you join us for the next iteration of this. Probably another online event given the ongoing pandemic, but hopefully you found this stimulating. Hopefully you found this a safe place to ask some of these really difficult questions, and hopefully you tell your friends about it and anybody who might be struggling with these kinds of issues. We want to have difficult conversations in an open and engaging way. We welcome them. We're not here to pontificate or propagandize to you. We want to have the difficult conversations that need to happen so we can live in a collectively liberated society. And again, I just want to thank you all for being here, and we're going to sign off now. We'll see you next time.